Qui vole Houston, you are listening to Sexto Sol, a weekly program on Chicano-Latino issues, and I'm your host, Ernesto Aguilar. This show tonight has generated a lot of interest all over the United States, and for good reason. Our guest sits down for his first ever radio interview with us this evening. Our guest, of course, is Jay Sakai, who wrote a book in the 1980s called Settlers, the Mythology of the White Proletariat. Sakai takes apart U.S. history, examining the development of the U.S. and the white working class, as well as oppressed nationalities, especially Mexicanos, Africans, Native nations, and Asians. He tears down popular lies about history and posts many, many fresh perspectives for revolutionaries of color. And I'd like to welcome Jay Sakai on the program tonight. Mr. Sakai, you there?
Okay. Hey.
How are you doing?
Well, okay.
It's a real honor to have you on the program. I got to be honest with you. I've been a reader of many, many of your writings, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful honor to have you on the program tonight. And you laugh.
Oh, hey, that sounds good. Okay.
Okay, well, I definitely want to kick right into it. Normally, the people who have heard the show before will know I normally play a little bit of music before I bring on a guest, but because this interview is the way that it is, I definitely wanted to jump right into a few questions that I had for you. Now, as I kind of mentioned in the introduction, in the early 80s, you wrote Settlers. It was a book that I think took a deep historical look at the role of white workers and the lives and the histories of oppressed people. Now, can you break down for listeners what inspired you to write the book Settlers and some of the ideas, or the most important ideas that you think you put forward in that book?
Well, I wrote it because at that time, and we're talking about the mid-'70s that I started working on it, it seemed to me that like every time there was, a struggle or an outbreak of something or an act of injustice happened, racism, there always more and more calls to study people of color. There are more books piling up about us. We're getting funded to do things, But actually, we're not the problem.
Excellent.
The problem is white people. So I said, well, what about them? The other thing, of course, is the time I was working in an auto parts plant. And as a revolutionary, I'd been taught all this stuff about class unity and how, white workers and workers of color were going to unite everything, except in real life, I didn't actually see that. What I saw was there were some good guys who were white, to be sure, but basically the white guys were pretty reactionary, and they were always selling us out. So I was trying to figure out, where did racism in the white working class actually begin? I mean, was there a point where, they started selling out or got misled or something?
And where did that lead you?
Well, that led me all the way back to Plymouth Rock, actually.
Whoa.
Because I kept, I'm not a historian. I wasn't then. I started reading, and I figured, well, maybe it happened in the 1930s, before we were born, or, maybe the 1920s. I kept going back and back, and it was like treading water. I never found ground. Finally, I figured out that actually there wasn't any time when the white working class wasn't white supremacist and racist and essentially pro-empire. So I couldn't figure out, well, how did this happen? That's when this whole idea came to me, which isn't my idea. But at the time, I knew a lot of African revolutionaries in exile from Zimbabwe and South Africa, whose people were doing guerrilla wars, against the colonial powers.
Right.
And so they were always talking about white people, but they didn't really mean race. They kept using the term settlers. And they kept talking about settler colonialism. Then I ran into some Palestinians, and they talked about the Israelis that way, that it was settler colonialism, i.e. that European populations had been imported into these countries to act as the agents for capitalism and for the ruling classes. And at that point, of course, the light bulb went on over my head. I said, my God, that describes America. I don't know why I was so dumb I didn't figure that out. But so that's kind of the central idea in the book Settlers, that the U.S. really isn't like a society in which there's different races and we're trying to get along. That may be true on the surface, but it's in its actual history, it's an empire of imported European settlers who always were given special privileges to be the occupation army over all the rest of us. That I can't say that made my book popular, but it certainly raised a lot of controversy at the time.
Do you think that some of the historical points that you brought out in the book originally, as you just mentioned, were the most important points that you brought out? Because I think, especially when you look at revolutionary literature, particularly anti-imperialist literature, over the past 30 years, 40 years, 50 years even, you don't see that point brought out as clearly as it was in Settlers in a lot of respects. I mean, there were a lot of points in literature in which that is being brought out, but I think that Settlers put it in a way that really crystallized it for a lot of people.
Well, in part because it was written at a juncture, a point in history, where we were going through all these intense struggles, in the 60s and 70s. And actually, my feeling, and I think a lot of people's feeling then was, we waited 400 years for the unity. So if it can't come in 400 years, then how long are we supposed to wait for this stuff? How real is it? Why don't we look at this idea instead of just taking it as a given? I mean, and I got to tell you that even in integrated stuff, the difference between different peoples really meant a lot back then. And it's one of the things I always tell young people I know who are, starting to learn about stuff, and that is that don't believe all the stuff you read in the history books and you see on television, stuff like that, because a lot of it's not true.
Indeed, it isn't. I want to definitely put this in a context for listeners who've heard the show before. When we talk about land and the settlement of land, one of the things we talked about on the show was that the Mexican land was settled in the early 1800s, and it resulted in the U.S. seizing over half of Mexico's land around 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and the places we know as Texas, Califas, Arizona, and many of the other states in the Southwest were actually ancestrally held by the Mexicans and became part of the United States as part of a forcible campaign to take that land. A lot of people, that's not really taught in history books in a lot of respects. How can you explain to people in very clear terms how the American West was settled, and how does that differ from the popular conceptions you were just mentioning about history? The examples I can think off the top of my head, cowboys and this rugged individualism and all these other things, people coming and settling the land that was just here, and buffalo dancing around happy and ready for the taking.
Well, that's the whole thing, The whole mythology of the West and the Southwest is that all this land was empty, and that Europeans came and they filled the land, because there was hardly anybody there before. And if they were there, they kind of weren't too important because just a few people, and they didn't know what they were doing. They were wandering around in the sun, kind of stuff. No idea that actually these are whole other nations, whole other societies. And the settler invasion, powered by immigration from Europe and the development of capitalist armies and, mechanization and industrialization, completely, over the course of centuries, overwhelmed all these other societies on the continent. The United States is a unique nation because it's always been an empire. It's never just been a nation of ordinary people. From its very beginnings, it's been an illegitimate nation in the sense that in order to become a nation, it had to conquer other people, take their land, and enslave them. There literally has been no point in American history where that wasn't true, because that's the basis of what being American is, which is, of course, the whole problem in the social character of the question of justice here.
Certainly.
So you see these struggles going on. I mean, I remember in the 1960s when Ruiz Tijerina and the Alliance was fighting on the Spanish land grant question in the Southwest, a lot of people had no idea that these grants had ever even existed, or that, in fact, legal title to much of the land in the Southwest was held, and still is held, by Mexican families and Chicano families. That this land was never, ever legally part of the United States in terms of being owned by white business interests. This land was all stolen at gunpoint. And time after time, Ruiz and his people would hold meetings. They'd produce documents, records from Mexico City and stuff like this, proving all these things. So this whole illusion that the Southwest, for example, was not populated, and they just expanded into it, filling the empty space with shopping malls and, factories and whatever they did, that's just nonsense. This is just conquest. I mean, it's no different than Japan invading China in the 1930s or, any other conquest of empire.
Indeed.
So that produces a peculiar dynamic inside America, because this is a country where the various citizens, the various parts of the population, actually their fundamental relationship was formed by war, not by peace. And of course, that still echoes into our lives today.
And I think that one of the important points that you mentioned in regard to Ruiz Tijerina's work around the land grant issue, one of the things that he brought out and he really exposed to a lot of Mexicanos was that a lot of these land grants and a lot of these treaties that had been made to ensure land grants that these families would have henceforth were violated. Not that it's a much of a revolutionary concept for anybody student of history to see that the United States violates land grants and violates treaties, but I think it exposed to, particularly to the 60s generation, to a lot of young Chicanos and Chicanas, that the U.S. doesn't very often honor these kinds of treaties and these grants at all, in a lot of respects. Jay, I know we're breaking off into a lot of issues, particularly of colonization and the settling land. Can you explain to people the difference? This is where the juncture for a lot of people breaks to in a lot of respects, meaning that a lot of people assume that this is an issue of racism or an issue of white supremacy purely. Can you explain to people what settlerism is and how that differs from racism, or how that differs from white supremacy, just so they understand exactly what that means?
Well, that's a good question. And certainly racism is a phenomenon that's worldwide. You have it in Japan and France and Russia and so forth. But what's different here and in countries like Canada, Israel, other places, South Africa, formerly, etc., is that the European population is not indigenous. The European population actually was imported as part of the process of colonialization to be an army of occupation over the conquered territories and peoples. And that's formed the essential character of the United States as a settler country. So that the question isn't just racism. The question is national divisions between people. For example, the question of self-determination for all colonized peoples always is at the heart of political matters. Because I think a lot of people, during the 60s, there was a lot of revolutionary nationalism. People talked about liberating Aztlan, the whole Southwest. A black revolutionary nationalist talked about liberating a black nation in the historically black majority South, the 5 states of the Black Belt. And of course, Indian activists talked about their native lands. A lot of people didn't understand kind of what this was about and viewed this as kind of, almost like legal questions of, are you entitled to this territory or that territory? Well, basically it isn't a legal question. It's a question of self-determination. The essence of decolonialization is really simple. The oppressor can't decide for the oppressed. Well, in America, that means that the white majority has no right to decide for the oppressed. I mean, how, for example, could that ever be just? It's true maybe they could have the majority of votes under their system, but I think that only Mexican people, indigenous people, Chicanos, various Native American peoples have the right to decide the destiny of the Southwest because that's theirs. I don't think white people have any vote in it at all. Not because I think there's something wrong with them as a race. It's just like, but frankly, the oppressors have no vote in deciding what the oppressed do with their society and their lives. And that's the most simplest kind of understanding of decolonialization you can have, but it's essential. So that the revolutionary nationalism that a lot of people in the 60s talked about gets confused when people look at it today, but it's all really about self-determination for oppressed people.
I think it's important what you just mentioned a little while back about the growth of the Chicano movement in the 60s and the understanding and the consciousness around Aztlan and around nationalism itself, particularly as it relates to raza. One of the criticisms that I've heard from white theorists is this. Although Chicanos identify as opposing the miseducation and genocide unleashed by the colonizing society, our identification being, of course, Latinos, Chicanos, with historical cultural icons such as the Aztec warriors, is no better. And this is, of course, from the academic theorists or whatever else. Now, you're someone who's analyzed a lot of these counterinsurgencies directed at oppressed people. You documented in Settlers, and you've written about it extensively in other writings as well. What is your perspective on that, and how do you think young Chicanos, in your view, look at this type of a criticism?
Well, you know, all I can say is that as an Asian guy, Bruce Lee was an enormous cultural kind of divide to us. Because before Bruce Lee, you know, we had no role models. This sounds funny, I guess, to people today. We had no images, you know. We weren't on TV, we weren't on movies. We just weren't there, right? Except that, you know, we were the cooks, you know.
Right.
In the Westerns, where there were almost no Mexicans because I guess they'd been killed.
Right.
And, you know, the Indians were being killed, and then there'd always be one Chinese guy who would be doing the cooking because, you know, the goddamn cowboys couldn't cook for themselves, I guess.
Of course.
But, you know, we had no image of ourselves, and that was strong, you know. And Bruce Lee was just fantastic in terms of that. And it just made an incredible difference, even though Bruce Lee was not there's nothing radical about his ideas per se. But it, you know, culturally it doesn't work like that. And I think a lot of the political correctness theory about who you should identify with or not is pretty artificial, and a lot of it is worse than artificial. I mean, like, I got to tell you, just as, I don't know, this is a long explanation, but if you read this book, Occupied America, by Rodolfo Cunha.
Great book.
Great book.
Great book.
It's heavy. It's incredibly detailed and rich. Fantastically good book.
Definitely.
But he talks about Reese Tijerina, and he mentions, just like in a line, that in May and June 1968, Tijerina participated in the Poor People's Campaign. There he proved to be an independent leader, threatening to pull the Chicano contingent out if the black organizers did not treat them better. That's only one sentence. Well, you know, to somebody who was there, to a lot of us who were there, Reese Tijerina was like, you know, a stroke of lightning falling on us. It was just a tremendous thing, just meeting him and watching him and the other people from the Alliance, although I think at that time they're calling themselves the Confederation of Free City-States.
Right. It's very interesting. Jose Angel Gutierrez with La Raza Unida Party, one of the founders, calls Urias the Chicano Malcolm X for the way that he approached his politics and the way that he was just so out front about it.
He was just an incredibly strong guy, and just, you know, I know I've heard there's criticism of him much later because he, I guess, got more conservative or got more tactical. I don't know. But I know that back then, it wasn't just that he led his guys and women and they occupied Kit Carson National Park, you know, and took over land and arrested sheriff's deputies and things like that for their illegal acts. It was just tremendously just. It was just wonderful. It's just, and this is the kind of thing you don't get out of these history books is, you know, by that time, we're talking about 1968, those of us who had been through the civil rights movement had really got us into politics. A lot of us were pretty cynical and pretty disillusioned because, well, you know, things had really, there was a lot of money to be made in the civil rights movement if you wanted to sell out, you know, cater to various interests, political interests, and the, you know, and the businesses and stuff.
Right.
There's a lot of corruption was starting to take place at the top. There's a lot of, you know, bureaucracy. I mean, the Poor People's Campaign, that's what got King killed, Martin Luther King killed, because he said he got out of the straight civil rights thing, and he said, really, we need to unite all the poor people in America, and I'm calling for everybody to come to Washington, D.C., and we're going to just take over the D.C. Mall. We're going to live there. We're going to pitch tents, thousands and thousands. We're just going to live there until our demands are met. We're opposed to, we want the end of the Vietnam War. We want, you know, all these things. Well, King had always very consciously had a policy, which he's public about. He fought local white Southern racists. He did not fight the federal government. He kept saying he's not fighting the federal government. This is when he decided he had to fight the federal government.
Right.
And he was proposing that all poor people unite in one movement against the government. Well, in my opinion, that's why they killed him. That was too much. He was supposed to be the safe alternative to Malcolm X and everybody, but he was turning radical himself. So even though he'd been assassinated during the preparations, his group went ahead and held a Poor People's Convention. Just imagine a sea of tents taking over Washington, the mall in Washington, which with the rain and everything else in the middle of the summer was just a sea of mud because thousands of people were living there and trampling there. And, you know, it was like, frankly, conditions were kind of miserable. There was no food. I remember a lot of mornings for breakfast, well, adults, there would be no food. And because the inside civil rights people and the bureaucracy stole all the money that had been donated for food. Some of the kids would get little boxes of dry cereal, no milk or anything, and no fruit. So, you know, when we met Reese and he heard about this, he just invited us all. I said, don't bring your kids, come to our place for lunch. He'd taken his people out, totally out. He took the Alliance out of the mud. He said, well, you know, we don't have to live like this to make our point. And he demanded that, you know, they find someplace better. In fact, they found a private school that was unoccupied during the summer and got permission for the Chicanos to use it. So hundreds of Chicanos moved in and, you know, fired up the kitchen. It was just a tremendous place. It was like a carnival, a school. It was just, you know. So, you know, Reese invited us and our kids to come eat lunch. It was just and he was an incredible guy because we were used to kind of these top-down leaders. I don't want to mention any names, but like the big leader would appear, you know, after he wouldn't be staying with us, of course. He was staying at a luxury hotel in D.C. And literally, I'm not fooling it, a limousine would pull up, and this guy would get out. He'd have his, overalls, but they were brand new, starched. He'd just taken them out of the bag, his brand new starched, white T-shirt, lead us on a few chants, pop back into his limousine, drive off.
That's messed up.
And Tijerino was a kind of one-man leadership type guy. But, he interpreted that as meaning if the demonstration, he wanted everybody to get up at 8, he'd be up at 7. If there wasn't enough food, he'd eat last.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just really impressive. Actually, one of the things that impressed me the most is he had this phenomenal memory. You'd talk to him for like 2 minutes, then a week later, you'd meet him. He'd remember your name. He'd remember every word you said because he was really listening to you. I mean, it was like an amazing kind of thing. And the Crusade for Justice people from Denver, Jorge Gonzalez's people,
right?
They were really impressive. There were like about 400 of them. There were like about half Chicano, half black. Maybe, I could be wrong. That's what it seemed to me. It was very much black.
Mm-hmm.
And very, very, shoulder to shoulder. It was really a tough group of people. So
it's kind of interesting. I've spoken with a documenter by the name of Jose Salvador Trevino, and he was a documenter of a lot of Jorge Gonzalez's work and a lot of the Chicano the Raza Youth Liberation conferences that were held out in Denver. And I think one of the things that he mentioned as he was coming to consciousness was that as he grew up, it was kind of a given for him that there were Chicanos and there were oppressed people who were working lawns or who were going to jail and all these other things. But one of the things that he learned from a lot of these people who were involved in movements and who talked about history was that they put these things in a context, and they made sure that people understood that there is a systemic reason why oppressed people are at lower economic rungs in this society, and not just the reason that they're there is not because they're lazy or shiftless or whatever else that the educational system puts on you. And I think one of the things that Jesus has said before is that Corky really brought a lot of those ideas out to so many young people to understand that oppression is not just something that happens out in this vacuum, but is very deep and very historical, and there's a reason for it.
Well, the other thing is, and I really remember this about the Chicano movement of the 1960s and 70s, is that people really practiced a lot of solidarity between oppressed peoples that you hear some people talk about, but sometimes is more lip service than real. And people like, when AIM did the takeover at Wounded Knee and got surrounded by the U.S. Army and had the siege and, got shot up and everything.
Yeah.
The largest demonstration in the U.S. was in Denver supporting them. The only actual large one. And it was the Crusade for Justice. It was mostly Chicano. When affirmative action first started getting attacked in California, I remember this one, in the early 80s, the law school, I think it was at Berkeley, ended the quota for Asian Americans, and the Chicanos offered to give part of their slots to Asians to fight for the principle, of representation. And a lot of that spirit has been lost in this because, there's this thing that's happening, which is that what used to be kind of militant politics against systemic injustice, against capitalism as a system, has turned into ethnic politics for a lot of people, with the kind of veneer of seeming to be militant, protesting about this and that, but underneath it is an attitude of we should just look out for ourselves. We really shouldn't care about anybody else but ourselves, and everybody else is we should say nice things, but potentially they could be an enemy. So we really should only think of us. And, I know that Asians are told that by conservative forces.
Right.
In our communities. And, certainly black people are told this. I mean, because it's kind of the American way you subvert militant consciousness in people's movements, is you try and make them more capitalist. Jefferson tried to do that with the Indians in the Confederacy, the Iroquois Confederacy. He told them, he sent them messages saying, you should join the United States because, see, your laws, you're good people. We want to get together with you, but your laws aren't any good. That's why we really need to bring you into our country instead of just leaving you in your country. Because, see, your laws don't protect private property. You share everything in common, And although he didn't say it, of course, the Iroquois Confederacy, women had tremendous legal powers under their laws of government. You couldn't have a war unless 3/4 of the mothers, women who had born children, voted for the war, for example, under their laws. No men could vote for war. So this was this is the indigenous kind of, way of having a society that Jefferson said, well, this is completely crazy. You really need to join us and have our laws which protect private property. You can get rich, and then, you'll like it much, much better. And of course, what he really meant is, we want to take you over, and if you don't have private property, you can't sell us everything you have, which is what we want you to do. So we're going to get you to do this, or we're going to shoot you, one or the other, which is their kind of standard approach to these things, as we can see in Afghanistan and Iraq.
I was actually just about to mention that as well.
Yeah, they're bringing democracy to Iraq, only they don't seem to be doing a very good job of it right now.
You see a lot of mounting resistance.
I just think there's, the thing is that they're invading the whole world, essentially. And it's true that I guess they can conquer any part of it they want to. But that doesn't mean that people are going to like them or put up with it or not resist. Of course people are going to resist, from all kinds of points of view. And I don't think this is ever going to end until they leave. That's actually what I think. And I think the same thing is true for America. I don't think there's any solution to any of these problems here until they desettlerize America.
That's actually going to get into another question. If you're just tuning in, we're speaking tonight with Jay Sakai, an anti-imperialist author who wrote the book Settlers and has written a number of texts on race and revolution. We're getting a couple of different calls as well as emails in with questions. And I guess one of the questions that was actually just sent in a little while ago, how is a country desettlerized? The U.S. or Israel was an example that was given. And also, I guess a sub-question to that is, I'll read it off, especially in a place like the U.S. where many righteous national liberation movements, the Black, New African, and Chicano movements especially, overlap and contradict native land claims and national liberation. Where does that all fit in?
Well, I don't think any of us are going to have problems solving our relations with each other as long as we kind of get the U.S. empire and capitalist ripoffs out of the way. Because it isn't true that there's plenty of land in America. Everybody could live here, who lives here quite well, with a lot of autonomy, a lot of justice, a lot of room for expression and development. But the obstacle isn't each other in that sense. And as for desettlerization, it's already happening because settlerism is a phenomenon of the past, really. All over the world, settler societies, well, you saw all the ones in Africa have essentially gone out of business. In Algeria, you had, which was officially a province of France until the 1950s revolution, you had 1 million French settlers living there, and virtually the whole of the French army occupying it. And finally, they all had to leave. And, Algeria has a lot of problems, but it is Algerian. I don't think that that's going to happen here, obviously, because there's no place, for that kind of migration to happen. But desettlerization isn't happening that way. Like in Israel, Israel is maintained. The problem is not that Jewish people live in Palestine. The problem is that there's special laws, unjust laws, that deny land to Palestinians who lived there, while, of course, giving land to Zionists, even though they may have no connection whatsoever to Palestine that anybody can prove, except they say that they follow the Jewish religion. They come from Russia, they come from Brooklyn, they come from wherever. Well, people look at America and they don't see how America could be desettlerized. But actually, it's being desettlerized right now. And it's funny, like the place where I work, all the other guys who work there are Mexican. They're not Chicano, they're Mexican. And they're first generation. This is not their home. Their home is back in Mexico. And they're very conservative family people in a social way, much more conservative than I am, for sure. They're kind of exactly the kind of Mexicans that the Republican Party and Bush are trying to aim at as the ideal minority. In fact, some of the guys, I think, voted for Bush because he sounded like, a better leader or something. So they're not radical in any political sense whatsoever. But, of course, it's interesting when you talk to them about America, they don't believe in the United States at all. Because what they think is that the United States and Mexico are really just kind of one country. To them, it isn't just Aztlan. It isn't just the Southwest.
Mm-hmm.
It's that there's Mexico, which is a special place to them, a really good place. Too poor, but a good place. As they say, it has everything but money.
Right.
And then there's America. Lots of different people live here. They think that's great, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they think that's actually just how it should be. Because to them, they've noticed this funny thing. And this is I don't want to insult anybody, but the way they look at it is, they've noticed Americans don't like to work. They notice that because we're in the suburbs, we're in the wealthy suburbs.
Right.
Well, there's Mexicans all over the place, of course, because all the landscaping,
mm-hmm.
the porters, the guys, unloading trucks, the people laying the masonry for the patio. All the workers are all Mexican. So their view is they don't quite understand America, but they've figured out one thing. Real Americans aren't into working. They don't understand it, but okay, fine by them. So to them, this is this huge land which, frankly, needs them because they're the people who are going to do the work. And they actually don't believe in a separate United States in any real sense of the word. Like immigration laws, borders. They just think that's nonsense. It isn't just because of the legal history. It's because really, to them, it's their country as much as anybody else's. And they're not nationalistic in any narrow sense about it. They talk about the fact that, Mexican guys live here and, they marry, one guy knows guys married a Polish woman immigrated from Poland. He thinks that's great, But to them, America doesn't belong to the people who call themselves Americans. That's the key difference where they differ from the Republicans and George Bush. So they have they're part of the actual reversal of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that's going on. Only it's happening in a very kind of modern or postmodern way. It isn't just simply a reversal in terms of the Southwest, where clearly the Southwest, the whole character of the Southwest is changing, year by year. I'm in the Midwest, and when the Mexican consulate said it was going to issue the ID cards so that people could get bank accounts and everything else, I mean, we literally had a traffic jam. There were 10,000 people lined up on the main business street. It was just completely bizarre. And all the right-wingers are just are having fits because they're writing letters to the newspapers like, this Mexican ID card, is as good as an American, birth certificate. You can do all this. How can we let this happen? Well, but the logic of modern globalized life is that they have to. The banks want to have bank accounts with this money in it. So they want these people to have consular IDs, which aren't American in any way whatsoever. And you can just see, year by year, the whole shift starting to happen socially, culturally. That it has to happen in a political sense, of course, and it hasn't yet. But you certainly can see the underlying kind of migration that's a migration not just geographically, but it's changing politics just as surely as when black people left the South and emigrated to the northern industrial cities, or when we Asians came to Hawaii and the West Coast in the 19th century.
Is that how you'd see desettlerization working, where you see this migration of peoples? It sounds like that's the way it's working in practice in the Midwest, and historically how it's worked for the South as well as the Northeast. Would you say that's how desettlerization will happen in the United States over the next few years as it is currently?
Well, that's the underlying kind of historical thing that's going to happen, but it isn't going to deal with the whole political struggle which we're now engaged in, because, of course, the white settler population has essentially, they've had a historic 400-year pact with capitalism, which is that they will get the best of everything. Maybe that won't be a lot, but it will be the best of the little. They will get the best of everything that is available in return for supporting capitalism and the U.S. empire and its conquest over other people and its exploitation. Well, frankly, that globalization and the desettlerization of North America is threatening that. And how long can you have a population in which more and more people don't actually work? I mean, the real welfare problem, you say the word welfare in America, and everybody's supposed to picture a black woman in a housing project. Well, the real welfare is white middle-class people, where you have entire office buildings in cities full of people who don't actually produce anything. They move paper around, they build people, they do things with it, but they don't actually produce anything. Everything that's produced is produced somewhere else by somebody else. And the question is, how long can that be maintained? I would say it's breaking down even now. It certainly is in Europe, and that's why there's fascist movements and all this right-wing stuff happening in Europe.
Definitely.
Because the social compact is breaking down, and it's going to happen here too. And the political struggle, it is not going to happen peacefully, in the sense of it isn't going to be some gradual social process, The underlying economics are one thing. The political struggle over who gets what out of that and whether there'll be a just society or not is a whole other question.
More questions from the audience. What are some of the biggest misconceptions about your writing, and how do you respond to some of the critics who have written about your writing?
Well, actually, although I've heard a lot of criticism, there hasn't been a lot of writing criticizing it. I always tell people, well, I don't have a problem with criticism. Just write down factually, where the mistakes are, and we can argue about that. At that point, people disappear because, they can't seem to locate those things. And I'd say the biggest misconception, though, is people think I'm talking about race alone, that everything is determined in America by race, and that's not really what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that race in America has been used as an identifier for capitalism to form and control classes. That race is really not just a metaphor for class, but an identifier of class in real terms. And so that everything is really upside down. Things that are racial are really about class, like affirmative action. Well, the real affirmative action is the enormous built-in advantages that white middle-class people, particularly from the suburban school systems, have at getting into universities and getting corporate jobs and networking. And everybody knows this. It's not a big deal. It's just facts, right? So that's the actual affirmative action. These other programs are really, to compensate for that, are just the warped forms that the civil rights victories of the 1960s forced upon the society. I mean, I don't really view them as, personally, as that significant. And the fight over them really is a fight, in a funny way, within settler society, within imperialism itself, over how it's going to manage itself. So that in the University of Michigan case, where Bush, supposedly on the advice of Condoleezza Rice, his African-American advisor, has weighed in on the side of opposing the university's affirmative action program, all of a sudden, all the three former Joint Chiefs of Staff, heads of the former West Point and Naval Academy, General Motors, Microsoft, and dozens of other major corporations have all filed briefs supporting affirmative action. So this is a fight. We're not in this fight, actually. I mean, this is like a pure ruling class fight, having it out with each other. And that's what's interesting about it, actually. It's their problem. Since it originally arose over law school, not something I would ever myself want to do or urge that any sane person do, I really could care less.
Mm-hmm. Another question from the audience: to what extent does your analysis depart, the analysis you just mentioned in regard to race and class, how does that depart from traditional Marxism that reduces everything to class? And where does your analysis, relate to or differ from anti-racist feminism presented by people like Gloria Anzaldúa, who say that all systems of oppression are connected in some way?
Well, to the last, I really agree. I mean, all systems of oppression are connected. It's sometimes the difficulty is figuring out what these connections are. And part of the problem that I have with anti-racist feminism is that a lot of it is very middle class, and it's used to actually muddy the question of oppression, i.e. suddenly everybody's oppression is equal. Well, actually, everybody's oppression isn't equal. And I tend to be pretty concrete about those things myself.
Thank you.
It's like, I can't count the number of people. In fact, growing up in a Japanese-American family, you've been to camp. When I was a little kid, people talked about camp, going to camp. This happened at camp. When I was a little kid, I didn't know that camp, this is deliberate. And it happened in almost everybody's family. it was a way of talking about being in the concentration camps without, being blunt and saying this, right? So if you're being overheard or whatever by the kids, it isn't anything, they don't know what you're talking about. I didn't actually find out about concentration camps till white people started stopping me on the street and giving me various explanations of why I shouldn't blame them for it. This when I was a young kid. And I can't count the number of people who told me that, this wasn't a real concentration camp you and your family were in. That was the Jews in Germany. See, they all got killed. That was the real concentration camp. You weren't really in a concentration camp. Oh, thanks. Well, actually, I would never say I've never met a Japanese American who said that what we went through was anything like what the Jews in Europe went through under Nazism. I've literally never heard anybody even hint that that could be true, because that would be crazy. You'd have to be a nut to think that. But it doesn't mean that what we went through wasn't real. It doesn't mean that there weren't terrible human losses out of it. And it doesn't mean that the reparations program that Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton did, isn't just a piece of junk, in my opinion, compared to what happened. It is not any actual reparations or justice. But, there's this funny thing where middle-class people are always inventing trendy ways to be oppressed, in which their oppression is somehow just as real as yours. Actually, I don't think so, but it's not my appointed task in life to argue with them. I do think, and this is true, that because of the interconnection of oppressions is something we still don't understand real well. Like a lot of people were having this political fight over Oliver Stone's movie JFK, which was supposed to be so radical because it says he was killed by a conspiracy.
Right.
Well, this is this complete piece of junk. I mean, who were the conspirators in the movie? I was sitting in the movie. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Well, the conspirators were this group of gay, stereotype, mincing kind of queens who at one point even wear dresses.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So
Right.
Gay people were the conspiracy that, killed JFK. This is the progressive, radical, threatening movie. I mean, give me a break here. This is nothing but homophobic junk. If you really wanted to have a movie in which you really showed the people who killed JFK, they'd be white guys wearing three-piece suits and sitting in corporate boardrooms and hanging out at the Pentagon. I mean, they wouldn't be like gay people from Latin America. Give me a break. The fact that could even go over in America without people just, burning down movie theaters shows how deeply ingrained the homophobia in this society is. For real.
Absolutely so. Absolutely. If you are just tuning in, we're speaking tonight with Jay Sakai, author of Settlers, as well as many other essays. Jay, we're running into the last about minute and a half to the show. Can you let people know, just kind of give people an idea of some of the things you're working on these days? I know you're doing some other writing, and just kind of let people know just what you've been up to at this point and some of the things to kind of keep an eye out for.
Well, actually, along with some other comrades, I've been working on trying to better understand the whole new popular wave of far right-wing politics and fascism in the world. Mm-hmm. Because to us, that's the new threatening phenomena that's happening. And, not just in Europe, but here in India, etc. So you always got to watch these... Hey, you got to watch the new semi-trailer coming up in your rearview mirror threatening to drive you off the road.
Definitely. No doubt about that.
Okay.
Beautiful. You are listening to Sexto Sol on 90.1 FM, KPFT in Houston. We've been speaking tonight with Jay Sakai. Jay, thank you very, very much for your time. We had quite a few more questions, but we couldn't get to everybody. Thank you very, very much for your time this evening.
It was a pleasure. Take care.
Definitely. Very, very much a pleasure.